Does that go? Are we on? Yes. Okay. We are up and running as we begin our study today. Thank you all for coming. And of course, we're going to be looking at Parashat Bo, which is one of those parshiot that I know I can always spell correctly in English, and no one's going to argue about how I'm supposed to spell it. Because you may have noticed, we as Jews seem to have an awful lot of arguments. No. See, thank you for arguing. Discussions. You're saying, he says we don't actually have that many arguments. You said my use of the word argument is wrong. It should have been discussion.
30 seconds.
And we haven't even got to the main point. Well, actually, that is kind of the main point, because we're going to be looking at a section in Parashat Bo which deals with one of the most symbolic, emblematic, well-known sections of Jewish life, and yet there is an infinite amount of disagreement over how this actually works, about what actually goes on. I'm talking about the most widely observed Jewish holiday, that is to say, even the people who are almost 100% secular still observe this, the activity of the Seder, right? The Seder. You would think something that's central to Judaism, as well known, would be all nice, crystal clear, and no problem. But it doesn't always feel that way. So how many spots are there on a Seder plate? Right? What counts as maror? What's your recipe for charoset? Right? We could probably have an entire hour's discussion just on those three topics. So we're going to look at A, what was originally said, that is to say the Torah itself, and then B, we're going to try and uncover some of the reasons why there is controversy over some of these things, and then also uncover how Judaism goes around to fix that. And fix is going to be left in sort of air quotes, but we'll work on it from there. Okay? Is that a plan? No one wants to get up and leave now that they know what we're talking about? Okay. So we are on Bo, chapter 12, from the book of Exodus, page 380, if you are using the Eitz Chaim. Chapter 12 of the book of Exodus. All right, so where are we in the narrative in Bo? Are we?
We're in the 10 plagues.
We're somewhere in the middle of the plagues, exactly. So we're actually coming up to number 10, and we're still in Egypt. The Egyptians still have refused to let us go. So Moses is now going to be giving some instructions to us rather than to Pharaoh. You know, he spent a lot of time talking to Pharaoh. Now he's actually talking to us again. All right. Okay. Reader? All right, by default? Sure. We can call you Miss Default.
Thank you. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first of the months of the year for you."
Right, so that means this must be the month of Nisan, not Tishrei, not Rosh Hashanah. Right, Rosh Hashanah is the head of the years. It is not the head of the months. We tip over the little digits on our calendar for Rosh Hashanah, but when it comes to the annual cycle of life that Judaism revolves around, it actually begins in Nisan. It actually begins in Nisan. By the way, what month are we now in today? Since today is the first day of the new month?
Shvat.
Shvat, exactly. Most famous for Tu B'Shvat, the 15th of Shvat. Okay, onward.
Speak to the whole community of Israel and say that on the 10th of this month, each of them shall take a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household. But if the household is too small for a lamb, let him share one with a neighbor who dwells nearby, in proportion to the number of persons. You shall contribute for the lamb according to what each household will eat.
Right, a lamb, I know we always think of the little picture of the boy holding the lamb and being tiny like this, but lambs are fairly large animals when they get ready for eating. And most families would not be able to eat it all in one night. Most of the time when they would kill a lamb to be eaten, they wouldn't plan to eat it all in one going. They would try to stretch out that meat as far as possible. But this lamb, as we're going to see, is a one-shot deal. And therefore, in order to make sure there's no waste, you would pool your resources and sort of buy a lamb or have dibs on parts of a lamb to do this as a group lamb. That sounds a little weird, but hopefully you understand.
And it seems very fair because you're going to pay for it according to how much you're going to eat.
Exactly. If I've got 10 people in my house, and you've got one person in your house, we're going to have a lamb with 11 shares, and I'll be paying for 10 shares. You'll be paying for one.
Very fair. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a yearling male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep watch over it until the 14th of this month. And all the assembled congregation of the Israelites shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they are to eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night. They shall eat it roasted over fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs.
Sounding familiar now? Maybe? So maybe most of us, I would guess, don't have lamb for Pesach. In fact, it's a very strong custom not to have lamb for Pesach, lest it look like we are trying to do this sacrifice, which we can't with the temple not in existence. But the other elements, the idea of having a big meal and the idea of having the matzah and the bitter herbs, that probably does seem very familiar to you. You're going to ask about the
doorpost.
Yes?
I don't understand why that's not part of our ritual that's handed down from generation to generation, because that's such a pivotal part of the story.
So why aren't we smearing blood on our doorposts each and every year?
Or something that symbolizes it.
Well, I mean, or something that symbolizes it, or it itself, right? The idea, of course, for the blood on the doorpost was this was a sign specifically with regards to the 10th plague. And as we are not subject to the 10th plague each and every year, it's not needed. So we still do the sacrifice in remembrance of the Exodus and in celebration of our freedom. But as we're not under the threat of the 10th plague, we don't need to do the marking that was intrinsic to it.
But anyway, our houses are marked because that's where we put the mezuzah.
Yeah, but that's
So God
not
knows where the
related.
Jewish households are now.
But like I said, there's no angel of death out there anyway. and certainly God doesn't need any markers. We needed the marker, not God.
I think the other part of what Howie wanted to say
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
was that the way this ritual is carried out in the Parsha
Mhm.
is by taking a bunch of hyssop
Mhm.
and dipping it in the blood and smearing it on the lintel. That hyssop is so full of symbolism. And here we've been dealing with a people and who have been and will continue to be somewhat arrogant at times.
Oh, occasionally, yes.
Hyssop being a very, the symbol of humility, wouldn't it be cool to have a bunch of hyssop on the Seder plate? But they didn't think that way.
It certainly is not what has come down as halakha, which is going to be sort of the operative phrase, which is this is the original Seder of Seders. And as you point out, there's blood on the door, there's hyssop being used, there's this lamb that's there. There's only being mentioned matzah and bitter herbs, right? There's no mention here of the charoset. There's no mention here of an egg. There's no mention here of another symbol of spring, or give or take, depending upon the Seder plate you have. There's no mention here necessarily of a Haggadah, maybe, sort of. We're going to see. So how did we end up with the Seder we've got, rather than just duplicating exactly what the Torah says in its own written form? That's going to be something we're going to wrestle with. So it's a good way to put us on the right track. All right, but let's finish off with the first Seder.
Okay. They shall eat the flesh that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or cooked in any way with water, but roasted, head, legs, and entrails over the fire. You shall not leave any of it over until morning. If any of it is left until morning, you shall burn it.
Right, so no Tupperware. And by the way, this is not a law for our modern Seders. You can have leftovers from the modern Seders, that's fine. Although there is a limit to how late the eating of the Seder can go. Although the praises and everything else can go. Midnight is the end for the meal portion. Okay.
This is how you shall eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it hurriedly. It is a Passover offering to the Lord. For that night I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. I will mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt, I, the Lord. And the blood on the houses where you are staying shall be a sign for you. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, so that no plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt.
Okay, so most of us, I'm guessing, probably don't gird our loins before the Seder. We might tie up the apron, but we don't gird the loins. If you come from a Sephardic family, you might eat with the staff at the table. And I don't mean the serving staff, I mean a staff. But most Ashkenazim do not have a custom of keeping a staff nearby in commemoration of this. But why were our first Seder folks eating this way?
So they could rush right out the door.
So they could leave, right? But does that mean they couldn't have left if they hadn't done this?
Well, they had to be nourished.
What's that?
They had to be nourished
They had to be nourished?
They'd have been hungry.
so they could make the march.
But had they been freed?
They were
No.
gonna be.
They were gonna be.
Yeah.
And that was the point of the staff and the Seder and the blood, was they were putting their faith in God. They were willing to say, God has said tomorrow we'll be free, so I'm going to act free tonight.
Wow.
I'm going to act like I believe that I will be free tomorrow, so I will eat this festive meal. I will stand ready to go because I am in perfect anticipation. Not hope, but actual anticipation that tomorrow we will go free. And that's an incredibly powerful statement to make, especially in light of the fact that if they didn't go free tomorrow, the Egyptians would know every single house that needed to have people inside of it killed. Because you've now staked your claim that you're going tomorrow. Otherwise, you've put a nice big symbol on the door that this is a house of someone who thought they were going to be free. You should probably go punish them.
Hurriedly
Hurriedly.
concerns me. They
Yes.
have to eat it hurriedly.
Yes, the chipazon.
And that's, the Seder, we always say that we have to
The 15-minute Seder, right? The
recline like kings.
mhm.
And,
How do you eat hurriedly?
yeah,
Exactly. So again, between this first Seder, which was eaten hurriedly as a symbol of anticipation, right? I'm eating quick because at any moment I'm going to be given the call to leave. And the Seder we eat, reclining and very much recumbent in a sense of being free people, seems entirely opposite, and yet they're meant to represent that same emotion of a faith and trust and of a gratitude for what is happening on that night. But you're right, we don't observe that identically in the way they did.
mhm.
So who decided that we should have the Seder be more relaxed rather than eat it hurriedly? I mean, it seems if you were reading this in the Torah, every year your Seder should be like a 15-minute, and get out in reenactment of the Exodus, and yet we don't.
That's a lot of preparation.
There's a lot of preparations for a 15-minute meal.
Oh,
Well,
boy.
but think about it this way. If you knew you only needed to prepare for a 15-minute meal, would you prepare as much?
Yeah.
Right? You're not going to have the matzo
Yes,
ball
I
soup because
would.
you can't eat it hot. Right? So you're just going to have something meaty and then
You're
the
gonna
bitter
have
herbs and the
lamb
matzah.
bitter
You're going to
herbs.
slap it together, take a nice bite, and out you go. Or at least, we're done. Stand up in that reenactment of the preparedness, but that's not how we do it.
Because we're not just biblical Jews.
We're not just biblical Jews.
We are also rabbinic Jews.
What does that mean?
That means tradition didn't stop being created. I can
Mhm.
put the pretenses all over the place.
It's okay.
At the end of this particular enslavement, history in a particular unfolding gave us yet another period where we were under the yoke. And
More than once, unfortunately, but yes.
for sure. But at the time of the destruction, when the rabbis were recreating Judaism, is that the right?
I wouldn't use the term recreating personally.
I don't know.
The word I'm going to use is reteaching, which is going to become important as we see the next continuation here, which is the Seder is meant to be a lesson plan. right? This is a curricular objective for the teacher, is to have the Seder, and the Seder is meant to be a lesson plan, but the lesson that's being taught is identical, even if the form is going to change in different circumstances. And we're going to, well, hopefully not belabor, but we're going to come back to that point a few different times in different ways. But let's see how the Torah continues here.
This day shall be to you one of remembrance. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord throughout the ages. You shall celebrate it as an institution for all times. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the very first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day to the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel.
All right, so there we begin to get the idea that the celebration of Pesach is going to last longer than just a one-night event, but that there is going to be this period of no leavening within our homes for a whole week. But we're going to go ahead and skip just down to page 24. There's a lot more details here that are given, but I want to look at not page 24, verse 24. Thank you. On page 386, verse 24, where we do another recap of what we're talking about here.
You shall observe this as an institution for all time, for you and for your descendants. And when you enter the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? You shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, because he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but saved our houses.
Okay, so that sound familiar to anyone? Yes? What's that from?
The Seder.
From the Seder, from the Haggadah, specifically. What is the meaning of this rite? Not Manashtana, but very close.
Yeah.
Another group of four.
The four sons.
The four sons. Exactly. So this is the four sons, right? When your children ask, or when your sons ask, if you want to be in a limited literal translation, what is this right to you, right? Maha avodah hazot lechem, right? That is the question that gets put into the mouth of the Rasha, the wicked son. And then the answer that is given, this is the Passover sacrifice because the Lord passed over. Is that the answer that's given to the wicked son in the Haggadah? No. I'll help you here. It's not.
No.
Okay, so we have a question here, which isn't being said as being wicked or not wicked. It's just your kids. And then we have an answer, which is not the answer that gets put into our Haggadah for the person who asks this particular question. Well, how did that change? I mean, why isn't that when the kid asks me, what is this right to you, that I should answer him exactly as the Torah says? Shouldn't I just quote, verse 27 if someone asks me verse 26? Does everyone understand my question?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Mm-hmm. If he asks you verse 26, you shall say verse 27. Why is it in our Haggadah that it doesn't work out that way?
Different people learn, different children learn different ways.
Different people, different children learn different ways, but this is what the Torah says. Okay, so we're going to actually do something a little different, because the way the discussion has developed, I think we're going to start on the back side first. I know, changing things up. Everyone, please just take a deep breath. It's okay. Whoops. Yeah, don't look at the front, please. The front was meant to be more of a preparation for these questions, but you guys are already on the ball and getting to these questions. So we'll go back to the front as an explanation rather than a preparation. And it should work both ways. Right? Because every now and then you adapt to fit your students. Hint, hint. All right, we all around? Everyone's passed out?
Yeah, we'll pass that.
After 4 cups of wine, Okay, so if you'll continue, this is from Mishnah Psachim. Remember, the Mishnah is the compilation of the oral law, the Torah Sheba Al Peh, that was compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, also sometimes just called Rabbi, in around the year 250 CE. The oral tradition was believed to have been transmitted at Mount Sinai along with the Torah, as an explanation, as the footnotes, you might say, the expansion and clarification to the written Torah. And one of the topics that comes up, as you might imagine, is how do you celebrate Pesach? And this is a small snippet from the Mishnah's explanation of how you do it.
They pour him a second cup, and here the child asks the parent, and according to the child's understanding, the parent teaches, beginning with shame and concluding with praise, interpreting from Arami Oved Avi, my father was a wandering Aramean, until he finishes the entire passage.
Okay, so there's our 4 sons. Did you blink? Right? In the Mishnah's description of the Haggadah, of how the telling goes, that's what Haggadah means, it's the telling, all right? It doesn't say there are 4 sons. It says that as you pour the second cup, you answer the questions the children have. That's also, by the way, in this area where we also get the Manish Tanah, although the original Mishnah only has 3 questions rather than 4. I know, just shattering all these illusions. So, and one of them doesn't even appear in our Haggadah anymore because we don't cook the meat the same way they cooked it. So they say the children will ask questions and you will answer according to their ability. And the framework that you'll use is this passage, right? The Arami Oved Avi, right? My father was a wandering Aramean, or an Aramean pursued or tried to destroy my father, depending upon your translation preferences according to different commentaries. But I don't see 4 sons mentioned here, and yet our Haggadah has 4 sons, right? Where'd they come from?
Well, something between shame and praise.
Somewhere between shame and praise, depending upon the son. They may either give you shame or...
4 points between those 2 extremes.
Okay, so we could see it as being there's 4 points between the shame and praise, and we can see it as being the fact that, as they say, the child will ask, and according to their understanding, you will answer, right? Implicit within this Mishnah is the idea that you will have to teach the Seder differently, even though you're using the same text, to different children, to those that are trying to learn, right? It's not just a question of if you quote the right text, you will answer, you will have taught your child. Does everyone see what I mean by that? Right? That if you want to teach them, you could say, well, I will teach you the Declaration of Independence. And by teaching you the Declaration of Independence, I mean I'm going to read you the Declaration of Independence and make sure you understand the vocabulary, and then we're done. Is that teaching the Declaration of Independence? Or is that simply exposing them to the Declaration of Independence? I would argue the latter. What the Mishnah is saying is you don't teach the story of the Exodus by simply reciting the story of the Exodus. That the teaching has to be adapted to fit each child in their own way. And then our modern Haggadah, which is still very, very old, but came after the Mishnah, gives us examples of how that could work, and deliberately goes out of its way to do things in those examples that subvert the natural order of question and answer as it appears in the Torah.
Why?
Why? So that you don't just answer by what the Torah said.
Isn't that a possible slippery slope?
Well, but
Yes.
you would teach a 4-year-old.
Absolutely.
You would teach a 4-year-old differently from a 10-year-old anyway. You couldn't do it the
I
same way.
appreciate
And you can have to understand that one child that asks you, what is the meaning of this right to you, needs to hear about this was when God took us out of Egypt. And another child who says, what is the meaning of this right to you? You need to put his teeth on edge.
Yeah.
Even though they ask the same question, you have to know the child well enough to know what is really being asked. And that is one reason I think why deliberately the 4 questions have been, the 4 children have been fungible. They have been played with over different centuries in different communities and mixed a little bit, as we're going to see a little bit of an example here. But if you look at the full framework of the 4 sons, there's been more than just this over the centuries. So we're going to go ahead and look at the wicked son, since this is the question that appears in our parasha. By the way, all the other 3 questions also appear in the Torah and also have their own answers. They're scattered throughout the Torah. They're not just in this section, though. So if anyone would like the list of quotes and the 4 questions and the full versions of the Yerushalmi and all of that, let me know. Happy to email it to you later.
What does the wicked son say? What does this avodah, this worship service, mean lachem, to you, to you and not to him, since he excluded himself from the community.
Wait a minute. Did our text back in verse 25 say that he was excluding himself from the community? No. It certainly doesn't seem that way.
What do you mean?
But the sages wanted to use this as an example that someone might ask a question that was asking a question that wasn't explicit, right? So they're saying, listen to the kid. If he's emphasizing the word lachem to you, he's asking a different question than someone who says, what is this avodah? If someone emphasizes avodah, then you would probably give them verse 27. You know, why are we doing this? Well, it's because of Passover and then the Exodus and all of that. But if they say, why are you doing this? You need to give them a different answer. And here's the one that you're probably most familiar with, right?
You should also set his teeth on edge and say to him, it is on account of what God did for me when I left Egypt. For me, and not for him. Had he been there, he would not have been redeemed.
Right, that's the text that most of us are probably familiar from the contemporary Haggadot that we use. Right, and the idea of putting his teeth on edge, does that mean you smack him? In some communities, that's the way they translate it. In other communities, it means you put a little fright in him by pointing out that he would have been left behind. That if that's the attitude you're taking, and it sounds like that's your attitude, then recognize you would not have been redeemed. Because, as we just said, what was the whole purpose of the Seder happening before we actually got freed?
To prove our faith.
To prove our faith, our commitment, our willingness to follow, even though the redemption hadn't begun yet. And he clearly seems to be saying, I'm not sure about this. And if you're not sure about it, when God comes calling, then you're going to be left behind. And he should understand the repercussions of that attitude, of what it would have meant back then and what it would mean for him today. But the Rishomi has a slightly different version.
Okay. What does the wicked son say? What does this worship, this avodah, mean, lachem, to you? What is this toil that you burden us with every year?
Right. That is in the Yerushalmi. That is not in our regular Haggadah. Right. So they, in quote, added, or the Haggadot deleted that phrase. It's a little bit hard to figure out exactly who was first and second on this. But in the Yerushalmi, it adds that extra phrase. Well, what difference does that phrase make in interpreting his question? Sure. Go ahead.
I think the us versus you or versus me, we are trying to create a community, and excluding oneself from the community by not saying, what does this mean to us?
Mhm.
Is
According to the Rishomi's interpretation of what is this service to you, we should hear from that child, why do you make us do this?
All that cooking.
All the cooking and cleaning and work and
everything.
everything else. Why do you make us go through this toil every year?
All of us are doing it.
Right? So he said us.
Yeah, but the issue is that he considers it a burden, which excludes him from it.
Exactly. He's excluded himself from the redemption, even though he feels a part of the burden, which means he has missed the point. That the burden wasn't to burden. The burden wasn't in order to make us toil. That wasn't why we're doing the Seder. The Seder is for us to feel redeemed. And if you only feel the burden without feeling part of the redemption, then you're in trouble again. But notice as we go on, no teeth.
Let's see.
Since he excluded, and he was right.
Okay, since he excluded himself from the community, you should also say to him, it is on account of what God did for me when I left Egypt. For me and not for him. Had he been there, he would not have been redeemed.
Right. So we got the same answer, but without putting teeth on edge. Now, maybe, and again, this is all very hypothetical, maybe that's because he wasn't just questioning why you would want to do this, the meal, but was specifically bemoaning the work that went into it. So maybe he has a leg to stand on, some small point. It is a lot of work, and he doesn't understand it yet. And maybe that is an attitude that will lead him towards wickedness as he gets older. But you don't need to smack him for it. You just need to help him understand the consequences of that decision. But if you only see this as burden, if you only see not just the Seder, but Torah, Judaism, and everything else, like living a good life, as being burdensome, as being toil, then you're not going to enjoy the fruits of redemption that have been granted because of what happened in our leaving of Egypt. That's a slightly more patient answer. No teeth on edge being involved. But the question was the same. But the parent heard it different. Is either one right or wrong?
Yeah.
Do you prefer one or the other? Would you like to take the Yerushalmi and put it in your Haggadah this year rather than using the standard Haggadah translation or text?
I think they're different questions.
Exactly.
I gotta mention that.
Yeah, you gotta finger point. Exactly right. Exactly right. They're different questions. But why are they different questions? I mean, did we not know what the real question was? Do we not have the right answer?
Because people have different meanings when they ask the questions you stated before.
Exactly right, because they're different kids at every Seder. And by kids, our tradition doesn't just mean, under the age of 13. It means all of us. Everybody who asks a question is looking for a slightly different answer because they're a slightly different person than the person next to them, even if their questions look identical. You as a teacher, and by teacher I mean someone who happens to understand something slightly better than the person next to you, has to be able to hear that. And if you don't, if you merely recite what you were taught, if you hear verse 26 and you just give them verse 27, you failed.
And oftentimes the question is actually a point position. I mean,
Sometimes questions aren't even
they're
questions.
not questions, they're just comments.
In the form of there's a question mark that happens to be at the end of the sentence, but that doesn't mean that they're really looking for an answer. They're trying to make a statement.
Yeah.
Yes. You listen to radio talk shows all the time where, do you have an actual question with this
Yes,
rant?
right.
And we can definitely feel that. By the way, I definitely advise either looking up on your own, or I can send you the originals. The other three sons are also all mixed. So the answer for the wise son can go to the simple son and vice versa between the different versions of the four sons. It's very, very complicated how they all get mixed up because people are complicated. And the way we try to teach them Torah has to vary. It has to have that flexibility built into it. It's not just a question of repeat, 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 repeat. Right, so we have the example there of the text just to make it life easier, but now let's go down to our last paragraph on this side of the page.
For who is there of all flesh that has heard the voice of the living God?
Right, from the book of Deuteronomy.
You heard his voice and remained alive, but the nations of the world hear and die.
Right, so this is God trying to say there's a difference, right? Remember, most theologies for most faiths imply private revelation, right? It's one person alone in the desert. It's one person alone on the mountaintop. It's one person in private contemplation and meditation. The idea of having a national revelation at Sinai, of God revealing God's presence and direction to an entire nation simultaneously for everyone, it was considered certainly in the ancient world to be ridiculous, because if God revealed himself to everyone, those that were not fit would all die. And so therefore it's impossible. And Deuteronomy, according to the Midrash, is trying to point out, yeah, except it wasn't impossible because it happened. But what does it mean that it happened? That we all heard God's revelation.
Come and see how the voice came to Israel, each according to his ability. The elderly heard the voice according to their ability, and the young according to their ability, the lads according to their ability, the children according to their ability, the infants according to their ability, the women according to their ability, and also Moses according to his ability. As it is stated, Moses speaks and God answers him in a voice that Moses could endure. So also, the voice of the Lord is in strength. It does not say in his strength, but in strength, which each one could endure.
All right. So the Midrash is trying to say, when God spoke to all of us, did we all hear the same thing?
No.
Yes and no.
If they knew the message, then I would say yes, actually.
Right. We all got the same message,
Right.
but did we all receive it in the same way?
be interpreted in different ways, and even though for the same person at a different stage of life and different situation.
Exactly. The elderly 1 year, was young before, and they would have heard it in different ways, and they probably still hear it differently day in, day out in their own life. And that idea that the message can be the same, that is to say, the core of what God was trying to reveal is the same, but the way that it was expressed to each of us would be different, is at the heart of the beauty of the Judaism, what is the beauty of the Seder, of trying to enshrine that notion that God can speak with one voice in 100,000 different ways. And it's also the reason why we get so many arguments. Because now each of us has a piece of the revelation. Each of us has a feeling of that message, but the wrapper, the version that it came to us in, was slightly different because it had to be to fit us, to enter our hearts. And what do we do with it then? How do we take it after that stage? Turn your page over. Okay, so the front page is all one page. It's all one quote, but it's actually a selection of quotes to summarize a text that was called the Geret Rav Shrira Gaon, which was one of the great Gaonim, which is one of the great sages that took over the leadership of our people after the Talmud had been compiled and finalized. And he got a lot of questions. We're talking about questions today. And a lot of the questions were, how do we know that what we know is what we should know? Right? We've got this thing called the Mishnah in particular, and then we have a whole compilation of commentary on it called the Talmud. But how do we know the Mishnah, which is at the heart of Jewish law, is what we're supposed to have? Because there's a lot of debate in it. I mean, in the Mishnah itself, not just about the Mishnah, but in the Mishnah, there seems to be debate. So explain this to me. And he did his best.
As long as the temple was standing, each one of his sages taught his students the explanations of scripture, Mishnah, and Talmud.
And Talmud here is not being anachronistic. Talmud means just general teaching of how the Mishnah, what the Mishnah means. And Mishnah means the general teaching of what the oral law was. It's not referring to the proper name, Mishnah Talmud, that is now easily available, published sets available at Amazon.
Using words which he composed for the occasion. And the sages would render halachic decisions for their students as they saw fit. Wisdom was abundant, and they were not troubled by other distractions.
All right, so we got that? Maybe? So what is he saying here about the early days of our teaching, when times were good, in the good old days? This is 1,000 years or more before his days. Actually,
light bulbs were a lot brighter.
What's that? Our light bulbs were a lot brighter, right? And not only were they a lot brighter, though, but the Mishnah that we currently have and the Talmud we currently have didn't need to be codified. It didn't need to be canonized.
Right.
The sages knew what the decisions were supposed to be. If someone came to them and said, I found this, or I found this in my chicken, and is it kosher or is it not kosher? Do I have to return it? Do I not return it? What's the law for this contract issue and all of that? The sages knew the answer, and they would explain it as they saw fit. They would explain it the way our Mishnah told us you should explain the Seder to a kid, right? That is to say, according to their ability. The law didn't change, but how it was explained would change from person to person, from student to student, from case to case, and from teacher to teacher. That is to say, different teachers just had different styles and different ways of explaining things. But the core remained the same consistently. Why? Because wisdom was abundant, and because there was nothing to cause more distractions and dissension and disagreement. Make sense? Oh, for the good old days.
But it's deeper than this.
Mhm.
So you have the sages, you have the teachers,
Right.
you have the students.
Right?
But then you have the simple farmer that was never a student, was
Mhm.
never a teacher, was never a sage. You have the simple farmer who's now responsible for the Seder, for his family,
Mhm.
in his house.
Right.
So for 1,500 years, you had these simple people
Mhm.
transmitting all of this knowledge to their children,
Right.
and to their family, supposedly accurately, and they were never really taught. They didn't have a Haggadah to
Right.
follow.
So the other 1,500 years, that is to say, between the Exodus and the Second Temple period that he's talking about here, there's a whole nother chapter in his book where he talks about the ups and downs of transmission. And he does not posit that it was a perfectly unblemished chain of transmission, but actually argues that there were periods where whole chunks of the Torah and the oral explanation in particular was lost or broken. And then it had to be reclaimed, rediscovered, and refined once again. And then it went through other periods of disintegration and reintegration over and over again. So it's not just a nostalgic happy days image. I'm picking this up at the point where it really starts to fall apart more permanently from its previous style. And the solution that comes afterwards, which is so novel and beautiful and also problematic. Oh, wait, you were still reading there. Yeah, thank you.
On account of all the upheavals, persecutions, and disturbances,
We're talking Roman occupation here.
the students did not serve the sages sufficiently, and disputes increased.
Right, so why was there more and more conflict among the different schools of thought? Outside influence, right? We were not allowed to study perfectly, and we had all these other problems, and that meant that the students weren't as good as they used to be, right? The students could not learn their teachers' ways perfectly, which is why Hillel and Shammai, famous for having disputations, had 3 disagreements. Hillel and Shammai had 3 disagreements. The schools of Hillel and Shammai, on the other hand, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, have tons of disagreements. Now, why should the students have more disagreements than their teachers? Because the students weren't so good. Because of the circumstances of the time, the students were not able to learn and master what they were trying to be taught well. And so they had more doubts. And when they had more doubts, they did the best they could. And the best they did was different than the best the other guys did. And now you get more friction, more disagreement. Following the narrative so far? Okay.
The reprieve after the destruction of the temple was an important time.
This is the Yavne period. Remember, after the destruction, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai takes the sages of Yavne and sets up shop, and the Romans led us. And what Sharira Gaon is saying is that was a blessing. That reprieve, and it's hard to imagine anything after the destruction of the Second Temple as being called a reprieve, but it was a reprieve. The Romans were not as brutal as they could have been, gave us a very important breathing space.
For the sages then convened in order to retrieve the laws that were nearly lost in the turmoil and persecutions, and as a result of the strife between the houses of Shammai and Hillel.
Okay, so they tried to put it back together again. To go back to Howie's question of what is this, just completely uninterrupted? They said, no, it almost got completely destroyed. And then because we had that period at Yavne after the destruction, when the Romans left us alone enough, we were able to pull it together.
Those sages toiled mightily and examined the material until they understood what the earlier masters had said and had practiced. Thus, they finally resolved all their doubts. The days of Rabbi, the son of Rabban Shimeon ben Gamliel,
which is almost 200 years later. So this is a whole period of reconsolidation of the law that had been disrupted by both internal disagreements as well as the external upheavals. They finally have pieced together what it's meant to be during the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi.
And those days were an opportune time. Rabbi arranged the Mishnah. The words of the Mishnah can be compared to the words of the Almighty to Moses. They were like a sign and a wonder. Rabbi did not produce these words with his own mind. Rather, they were the teachings of the early sages who preceded him.
Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi says, finally we have recaptured what the correct teachings of the oral law should be. We've finally done this almost mental archaeology of re-examining all the fragments and teachings from all the different sages that have come down, despite all the persecutions and problems and internal disagreements, and we've got a clean version of what it's meant to be. Think very archaeologically, like trying to put together the skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And you got a bone over here and a bone over here, and you're piecing them together, and finally when you're done, you step back and you say, wow, that's something.
When was the period of the Yavne?
It was right after 70.
Right after.
Right after.
Okay.
Right.
And it was not written down at the time.
Well, it wasn't written down. It was discussed, debated, and began to coalesce. And there, when you read through the Talmud and in particular, but the Mishnah also has hints. They talk about many of the disagreements, debates of who was in charge, who wasn't in charge, how they settled issues, and began to re-clarify what the law was meant to be.
So for a couple of hundred years, there was Masorah again, back on track.
Exactly.
And that's where you go.
And Yehuda Hanassi says, look, right now, while I'm in charge, I am doing pretty well with the Roman authorities. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi had a pretty good thing going, you might say. He had a lot of authority within the Jewish world, and he had relative, in quotes again, peace with the Romans. And so he took this opportunity to say, we're not going to go through this again, right? We're going to document what the oral law is permanently, so that it can't be disrupted should something else happen. That we're not doing this again.
So you'll never have any arguments again, because it'll be clear.
Exactly.
I got
Yeah, that's the intention. Yeah, we got it right. Let's just get it down on paper, then we can all go home.
However,
Yeah, there's always a however.
however, even though their basic principles had already been taught by the early sages, Rabbi arranged their halachot. Some of them he taught in the original wording, and others he worded as he saw fit. Every anonymous Mishnah is from Rabbi Meir, but he did not create them from his own heart. Rather, Rabbi Meir had a certain way of teaching the Mishnayot to his disciples, and Rabbi chose and established this way to teach to everyone.
Okay, so all the different sages of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's era and preceding him were still going on with what we saw back up at the first paragraph, which is they would teach it in their own way. So if you wanted to know how to light Hanukkah candles, they would teach you how to light Hanukkah candles, but they wouldn't be quoting from a singular source. They would be quoting how their masters taught them, and slightly modified, with a longer explanation or shorter explanation or different analogy or parable, according to who they were teaching. And what this is saying is that the teachings of Rabbi Meir, the way he did it, was preferred generally for Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and that was the bulk of the material he used when he wanted to compile the Mishnah. In fact, anything that doesn't say, Rabbi so-and-so said, we assume is the teachings of Rabbi Meir. Make sense? That's why it's anonymous, but it's not really anonymous. It's just, you got tired of writing Rabbi Meir says, Rabbi Meir says, Rabbi Meir. Actually, there's other reasons too, but we're not going to get into those today.
Rabbi chose the way of Rabbi Meir, which was the way of Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi saw that Rabbi Meir's way was succinct and easy to teach. His statements were well composed, each topic placed with that which was similar to it. His teachings were more exact than any of the other Tanaim.
Tanaim is the name for that group of rabbis, for that era of rabbis.
They were more exact without superfluous language. Each word makes a vital point without unnecessary exaggeration. Nothing was missing or extra, except in a few instances.
This is not God.
The way was concise. Great and wondrous things were included in every single word.
Okay, so no, you don't need to turn it over because you already did the over. I know, it's misleading. So Rabbi Meir's teaching style was preferred for the codification of the Mishnah, because that way we would have a very precise and non-loose version that could then be studied precisely by future generations to get meaning out of each and every word. And that way you wouldn't worry about, oh, that was just a random analogy, or that was just a stray thought, or that wasn't important really. You could really take it apart, which is precisely what the Talmud does. The Talmud treats every word of the Mishnah as though it was specifically chosen. That's one of our basic principles. And so I wasn't bringing this just to teach you how wonderful the Mishnah is, although the Mishnah is wonderful, but to come back to the question that we began with, which was, so how do we teach? So if someone has a question now about when do I light Hanukkah candles, how do I build my sukkah, what do I have to do, vis-a-vis my responsibilities to my wife, we just need to quote chapter and verse for Mishnah, right? Or chapter and Mishnah, Mishnayot, the paragraph for them. Isn't that what this is saying? Because now we know.
Makes your job easier.
Makes my job easier, yeah. But is that what it said? No?
It says you have to adapt it to the person, the understanding of the person who's asking. And That's just the essence of teaching.
You've got the text that will give you the core and the foundation, so that you're not going to teach anything that is not right. That is to say, you're not going to give the student a law or a teaching that is against Torah, against Judaism. But your job isn't done just because you recited it to them. That's the beginning of the job of the teacher, is to give them that same shared text so that we're sure that we're starting from a clean, correct starting point. And then the teaching begins. And then you need to explain according to the ability and the understanding of the student.
But all too often, it's the individual interpretation of that teacher, by that teacher,
Mm-hmm.
and what he's hearing
Yes?
Slippery
that
slope.
that is being projected onto the student.
Exactly right. So if I may, it's for those of you that are in like computer sciences and such, it's a great exercise in how do you make sure your information is correct, right? Because what we're saying here is basically that what we'll pick it up from the Mishnah is that you have a perfect Mishnah, but the Mishnah is encoded, meaning that you can read it and still get the wrong answer if you don't use the right code to decipher it. Because it's a compressed information, and if you need to get the information out of it, it has to be explained to you, and it's going to be explained to you a little differently than explained to her, because each person is a little different. Welcome to being human. So I'm going to explain it to Rabbi 1, and I'm going to explain it to Rabbi 2, and I'm going to explain it to Rabbi 3, and Rabbi 1, 2, and 3 are each going to hear it slightly differently because they're human. And then when they turn around and teach it to their students, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Well, now this is going to be a little bit of a different understanding of what this guy heard, which was different than what the Mishnah itself originally was from the first master. And now eventually, slippery slope. I mean, this guy's understanding compared to this guy, which is going to be student 9, is going to be completely different. So what happens? We're dead? I mean, after 2 generations, we've already, introduced so many errors into the transmission that the original Mishnah, doesn't matter that we have the clean text, the understanding of it is completely shot. Do we have no way to fix this? How do we fix this in modern, information technology? How do you make sure that the data that gets sent to your computer from some website is the correct data? How do you know what shows up on your monitor is what the original website looks like? I mean, for all you know, Google's done horrible things to it.
Yes.
Of course you know.
Use the same key.
Use the what?
Same key.
Use the same key, right? So there is a key that you can use that will help you understand whether all of this, you check. What? That's like a separate code that says, okay, if this is that, then that means the key that I can use the key to double check that this was correctly transmitted, right? If I got the right answer at the end, then the data that I get will match a certain piece of data from the original, and that will tell me that I got the right version. And if it doesn't match, then I know that somehow it got corrupted, and then I'll ask for another version of it. Right? So there's a built-in correction for most of our modern technological transmission to make sure that works. But, and by the way, this does happen, which is, the student asks questions, which is basically Rabbi 1 asks the first rabbi, so what you're saying is, and restates it back to the teacher, and the teacher says, yes, that's right, then bing, they got it right, right? Back and forth between teacher and student to make sure they got it right. Before the student walks away. It's not like the game of telephone where you hear it once and then you're supposed to remember it. There's back and forth. But there is another way that this works that is even more important, which is horizontally. Right? So this is a vertical correction, but there's also a horizontal correction, which means if my transmission was correct, then my transmission and your transmission have to work together. If my piece is completely different than your piece, then that means somewhere along the line, one of our pieces was mistaken. And then we can debate and discuss and argue until we figure out what the correct version looks like. And that will put in a it'll reintroduce the correct version for the next generation.
Or we settle for two versions.
What? Or sometimes we settle for multiple versions where we recognize that the difference is not a difference in the core Mishnah,
Right.
but the difference is a difference in custom or minhag.
Exactly.
Exactly right. So that is, I guess I should say, a third option, which is the self-correction that happens can sometimes say, oh, this is just simply out of bounds. I mean, or out of parameters, which means that if you want your background to be blue or you want your background to be white, both are fine. You know, if you want to have 6 spots on your Seder plate or 5 spots on your Seder plate, that's okay, because there are different customs for both of that. If you want to get rid of the bitter herbs, meh, 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 now we've got a problem, because my self-correction with people of my own generation and my own self-correction with my teachers told me that was essential, and that was not negotiable.
Which is why Gemara has representative opinions in it and records the arguments.
Exactly right, because the Talmud that we now have, which is a record of this style of debate and discussion, is there to try and establish for us exactly this process, which is, we know that there is a slippery slope, that the Mishnah is only according to transmission, and if someone either deliberately or accidentally inserts a mistaken understanding, that it's going to mess up every generation afterwards. The Talmud explicitly says that's why you need to, A, double check between teacher and student, but also horizontally check between people of the same generation to make sure that those errors can be weeded out. And to make sure also that you're not arguing about something that's inconsequential. Because sometimes not everything is worth the full-blown error correction type argument.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And coincidentally or non-coincidentally, the other thing happening during this time is the spreading of Christianity.
Yes.
That's taking Judaism and transferring it into something else.
And using a very different key for understanding the Torah than our oral law, and coming to wildly different conclusions about a lot of different pieces, which we had an apparatus in place which said, no, that doesn't fit this understanding. It can't, because we have far too much evidence from far too many sources that is not a native opinion. That's a deliberate attempt to change this interpretation. And you're welcome to it, but you're not welcome to call it Judaism. And ironically as well, the church eventually would handle this self-same problem of how do you have a reliable chain of tradition that can be believed to be the core of what is true, by saying, you do this. No, they said you do that. You got one opinion and that's it.
Yeah.
And as long as you copy it perfectly and nobody asks too many questions, we're okay. Which is, you have a creed, you have dogma, you memorize it, you repeat it, and you're done. Judaism said that doesn't work, because in the act of repeating it and understanding it, there's always going to be room for misunderstanding it. And you have to have a self-correcting apparatus in order to make sure that works. And this apparatus has worked for 2,000 years. Right. For 2,000 years, we never went through the same terror of losing sight of the oral law like our ancestors went through, because the chain of tradition and the ability to self-correct that chain over and over again means that we have a good understanding of what we're supposed to do when we sit around that Seder table, and that it works. And we have enough flexibility within this system to make sure it works for every person around the table, that we're not simply repeating by rote a set of texts that were handed down by previous generations, but that we are repeating a set of understandings that are embodied in a set of texts for all generations. Questions, comments? I highly recommend getting the full copy, by the way, of the Iggeret. It is a fascinating read of early Jewish self-documentary, because we don't get a lot of that. But it's really just an amazing understanding and how self-reflective we were already at this stage. Notice that Rav Sharira Gaon did not say, don't ask questions about where this came from, just do as I say. He said, no, these are very good questions.
But
And
he
we
also
have...
didn't use divine inspiration in any of this. And that surprised me.
Because you can't count on divine inspiration in order to prove your system right. The system has to be self-correcting without outside influence. Now, you can argue that divine influence is what made us come up with this and made this system work in the first place.
Exactly.
But if I say it's always going to be right because of divine influence, then I don't have to work so hard.
That's the story of the bot call.
Right, the bat kol for the Tanur Shel Achnai, right? It's we don't listen to voices from heaven when we're deciding halacha. We listen to each other, arguing it out until we're sure that we've got the right piece for the tradition. And once we've got it, then we're good. And then it becomes part, and then it gets transmitted, and what it means gets transmitted along with it. And that has been a superb strength to our people. And it doesn't take God out of the equation, but it doesn't make the equation rely on God's explicit presence. That it works whether you see God or not. And that was essential for making sure that this legal tradition could continue. Because you're going to have some kids that say, what does that mean to you? And you had to make sure this worked, whether they saw the God part of it or not. Are you? You seem.
Yes,
Yeah.
within Judaism, there are different denominations.
Yes. So when we get to the 1800s, this system is challenged for the first time, not from itself, but because of, what was the phrase? Upheavals, persecutions, and disturbances. That is to say, for the first time, we have people, especially from within, who decide the system isn't working. And so you get that first with the Reform movement, which is, again, I always say is very different in the 1800s than you see in the 1900s and 21st century. But the early Reform movement expressly said, all of this, bogus, and we're not buying it. They didn't say there were flaws or the tweaks or the transmission was corrupted. They just said, nah, not doing it. We have our own understanding of how we're supposed to live Jewishly, and we're running with it. And if that means organs on Sunday, that means organs on Sunday. And if that means having shellfish and pork on Shabbos night, why not? So they ran with it very deliberately, or they ran away from it very deliberately. And then you had the rise of what eventually became ultra-Orthodoxy, which said, if they're running that way, we've got to run this way. And we've been trying to figure out how to keep this system working despite this fracturing of reliance on it for the last 200 years. And all the modern movements, and by modern I mean contemporary movements, ultra-Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy, the Hasidic movements, the conservative movements, Reconstructionist, Reform, secular humanist, Zionist, all of them have been trying to answer this same question and bring us to some peace again, the same way that the Mishnah did 2,000 years ago. And I'll get back to you when we get that.
Okay.
So,
But there will always be a however.
of course there'll be a however.
Always.
Because there's
Or
always
on the other hand.
there's always a student with a new question. There's always a teacher to explain it in a slightly different way. And that is its strength, not its weakness.
It's exactly how I feel.
And within the same school,
Of course.
the same yeshiva, you can have one Rebbe that says one thing and
Mhm.
another one that interprets it differently, and that student is going to absorb what he chooses to absorb.
Hmm. Well, not what he chooses. He will absorb, if it's a good school, he will absorb what is central, what is core, and what is shared between both of those two rabbis that transcends the differences on one issue or another. And that's the core of what you learn when you learn Torah and Mishnah and Talmud, is you learn what transcends the differences of opinions and why the differences of opinions are actually part of the whole rather than fractures in the whole. And then, depending upon the level of the student's learning, either he will eventually be ordained and make his own decisions based upon two different teachings of what he will do for him and himself and his community. Or if he doesn't become ordained, he will rely on one opinion or the other to the best of his knowledge of which one seems to be the most solid or correct. And then transmit that to the next generation. And if he got it completely wrong, and that's one of the beautiful things, and I wish I hadn't erased it now. That's one of the beautiful things is you can go down 9 generations, and even if you end up with one group splintering off and making lots of mistakes, eventually it can be brought back into line. It can be self-corrected even 9 generations later, as it begins to butt up against other groups with other teachings that say, well, actually, guys, that doesn't sound quite like what we've learned. And then you begin to analyze it and see where the discrepancies crept in and how to bring it back. And also, like we said before, what aren't really discrepancies, but are just custom. And those can be just left to continue on their own way.
Isn't that happening in Israel today, where the Ashkenazic and Sephardim are now living together, intermarrying, and trying to make sense of these traditions?
The only difference, because it's a beautiful thing to have these two major worlds of Judaism come back together again, especially in Israel. But the only difficult thing is that much of that is currently being colored by politics. That's the only part that makes it painful. But you're right. The combined efforts of finding what is common and core and central to both of the two main branches of Judaism is a wonderful discussion. And seeing how much this worked, despite the fact that there was so much separation between the Ashkenazic and Sephardic worlds during some generations, it's amazing that it worked so well. Because when they came back together again in the land of Israel, it's like, okay, so you're wearing a turban and I'm wearing a hat from Europe, but we're both Jewish, and I can see the Judaism in you and what you do day in, day out, and you don't feel like a stranger to me, and that's precisely because of the way this worked. So next time you're at the Seder, keep that in mind.
No, I don't want to do this.
No, just
Next Thursday.
Then I'm going to